The scream tore through the trees, before Elira even understood what she was hearing. It was not a human scream. It was low and rough, like something enormous had been struck by a blade, and was fighting the pain instead of giving in to it. Elira froze with a basket of wild mushrooms hanging from her arm, her bare feet sinking into the cold mud of the forest floor. The sound came again, closer this time, shaking a flock of birds out of the branches above her head. Her first thought was to run. Every instinct in her small, clumsy body told her to turn around and go back to her cottage, bolt the door, and pretend she had heard nothing. She was an omega, who tripped over roots on a clear path, who dropped baskets, who once fell into her own well trying to fetch a bucket. She was not the kind of person who walked toward danger. And yet her feet moved forward. She told herself it was only curiosity. She told herself that if something was hurt, it deserved to be looked at, even if that something might be a bear or a wild boar with tusks long enough to open her stomach. She told herself many things as she pushed through a wall of thorn bushes, and none of those things prepared her for what she found on the other side. A wolf lay on the ground, and it was unlike any wolf she had ever seen. It was the size of a horse. Its fur was black as the deepest part of night, so black that it seemed to drink in the little sunlight that reached the forest floor. One of its massive hind legs was caught in an iron trap, the metal teeth buried deep into muscle, and blood had turned the leaves beneath it a dark, wet red. The animal's chest rose and fell in short, painful bursts. Its eyes, when they found her, were a strange and startling shade of gold. Elira's basket slipped from her fingers. Mushrooms rolled across the ground and disappeared into the underbrush. She should have run. Every villager she had ever known would have run. Wolves this size did not exist in the stories told to frighten children. They existed in nightmares told to frighten grown men. But there was something in those golden eyes that was not hunger and was not rage. It was simply pain, raw and honest, the kind of pain that made even a monster look small. "Please don't kill me," she whispered, though she was not entirely sure whether she was speaking to the wolf or to herself. The wolf did not move. It watched her with the stillness of something conserving its last strength, and that stillness was somehow more frightening than if it had lunged. Elira took one step closer, then another. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her hands, for once in her clumsy life, were steady. "I am not going to hurt you," she said, keeping her voice low and even, the way she spoke to frightened lambs during birthing season. "I only want to help. That trap is going to kill you if it stays there." The wolf's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. It did not snarl. It did not show its teeth. It simply watched her, and something about that steady golden gaze made Elira feel as though the animal understood every word she said, which was impossible, and yet she could not shake the feeling. She knelt beside the massive leg, close enough now that she could feel heat radiating from the wolf's body, close enough to smell blood and damp fur and the earthy scent of the forest floor. Her hands trembled as she gripped the cold iron of the trap. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I am sorry. I have to open it." The wolf let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, and Elira pressed all her weight down on the release lever. Nothing happened. She tried again, throwing her small body against the metal with everything she had, and this time, the trap groaned and shifted. The wolf's whole body tensed. Elira gritted her teeth and pushed harder, feeling the metal bite into her palms, and finally, with a sharp metallic snap, the jaws of the trap sprang open. The wolf let out a breath that sounded almost human in its relief. Elira fell backward onto the leaves, her palms stinging, her heart hammering. For a long moment neither of them moved. The wolf lay with its leg free but bleeding heavily, and Elira sat a few feet away, staring at the creature she had just touched, wondering if she had made the worst decision of her short and clumsy life. "You need to be cleaned up," she said finally, more to fill the silence than anything else. "That wound will turn bad if it's left like this." The wolf's golden eyes tracked her as she stood, brushing dirt from her worn dress. She had no idea what she was doing. She had no idea why a creature this size, a creature that could end her life with one bite, seemed content to simply lie there and watch her instead of running deeper into the trees. But something told her, some quiet and unfamiliar instinct, that this wolf was not going to hurt her. She turned and began walking toward her cottage, glancing back every few steps to see if the wolf was following. It was. Slowly, painfully, dragging its injured leg through the underbrush, the enormous black wolf followed the small, clumsy Omega through the forest, past the crooked fence that marked the edge of her property, and up to the door of the tiny cottage she called home. Elira's cottage was not much to look at. It sat at the very edge of Thornwood Hollow, far enough from the village that the other Omegas rarely bothered to visit, close enough to the forest that wild animals sometimes wandered through her garden at night. She had built the fence herself, badly, with posts that leaned at odd angles. She had patched the roof herself too, and it leaked whenever it rained hard enough. It was not a home fit for a queen, but it was hers, and she had grown to love its imperfections, the way she had learned to love her own. She pushed open the door and looked back at the wolf, who now stood at the threshold, seeming almost too large for the doorway itself. "I don't know if this is a good idea," she admitted, mostly to herself, "but you can't stay out here bleeding all night." The wolf lowered its great head and stepped inside. What followed was, without question, the strangest hour of Elira's entire life. She filled 2 buckets from the well outside, her arms shaking from the effort, and carried them back into the cottage where the wolf had settled itself in front of her small hearth, watching her every movement with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. She found the cleanest cloth she owned, an old apron that had once belonged to her mother, and tore it into strips. "This is going to sting," she warned, kneeling beside the injured leg. "I don't have anything for the pain. I only have water and herbs, and hope that you don't decide to eat me halfway through." The wolf made a low sound that, if Elira did not know better, she would have called amusement. She poured water over the wound first, watching the dirt and dried blood wash away to reveal torn flesh beneath. The wolf's whole body went rigid, muscles bunching beneath black fur, and for one terrifying second, Elira was certain it was about to snap at her. Instead, it simply endured, breathing hard through its nose, golden eyes locked on hers, as though her gaze alone was enough to keep it steady. "You're being very brave," she said softly, dabbing at the wound with the torn cloth. "Braver than I would be, I think. I cry when I get a splinter." She did not know why she was talking so much. Perhaps it was nerves. Perhaps it was the strange comfort of having something to fill the silence while her hands did work far outside anything she had ever attempted. She had tended sick lambs before. She had bandaged the scraped knees of village children. She had never, in her life, cleaned the wound of a wolf larger than any horse she had ever seen, a wolf whose eyes seemed to hold more understanding than any animal reasonably should. As she worked, she noticed something odd. Beneath the dirt and blood, the wolf's fur was not merely black. It shimmered faintly in the firelight, almost silver at certain angles, like the surface of a lake under moonlight. She had never seen fur like it. She had never seen a wolf like this at all, and some small, quiet part of her mind, the part that had grown up on stories of shifters and the old packs of the north, wondered if this creature was something more than what it appeared to be. She pushed the thought away. It was easier to focus on the wound in front of her, on wrapping clean cloth around torn muscle, on the simple, familiar rhythm of caring for something hurt. This she understood. This she was good at, clumsy hands or not. When she finished bandaging the leg, she sat back on her heels and studied her work. It was not elegant. The wrapping was uneven in places, and she had used far more cloth than was probably necessary, but it would hold. "There," she said, wiping her hands on her skirt. "That should keep the wound clean until it starts to heal. You'll want to rest that leg. No running through forest chasing rabbits for a while." The wolf tilted its massive head at her, an expression so close to confusion that Elira almost laughed despite everything. She fed the fire and set a pot of water to boil, more out of habit than any real plan, and it was only then, as the cottage filled with warmth and the low crackle of burning wood, that the weight of the day finally caught up with her. Her hands began to shake. Her knees felt weak. She sank into the single wooden chair beside her hearth and stared at the enormous creature lying on her floor, blood soaking through the bandage she had just applied, golden eyes never leaving her face. "I don't know what you are," she whispered, "but I don't think you're just a wolf." The creature did not answer, of course. It could not, and yet something in the way it watched her, patient and searching and strangely gentle for something so large, made her wonder if it understood her perfectly well, and simply had no way to say so. Outside, the sun began to sink behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Elira knew she should be afraid. She knew that any sensible person would have run the moment they saw a wolf that size caught in a trap, would have fetched hunters from the village, instead of dragging the beast home to bleed on their floor. But sensible had never quite described her, not since she was a small pup falling over her own feet during pack training, not since the day her own pack had looked at her clumsiness and decided she was not worth keeping. She had been cast out for being too much trouble, too slow, too prone to breaking things that mattered. She had built this small, crooked life for herself at the edge of the world, because no one else wanted her in the center of theirs. And yet here she was, in this small, crooked cottage, tending to a creature far more dangerous and far more magnificent than anything her old pack had ever produced. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like a burden. She felt useful. She felt, strange as it was to admit even to herself, needed. The wolf shifted closer to the fire, careful of its bandaged leg, and let out a long, slow breath that sounded almost like relief. Elira watched the flames dance across its black fur, watched the way the firelight caught those unusual golden eyes, and felt a small and unfamiliar warmth settle in her chest. "You can stay tonight," she said quietly, as though the wolf had asked permission, as though this enormous, impossible creature needed her approval to remain beneath her roof. "Just tonight. Then you should go back to wherever wolves like you belong." The wolf's tail thumped once against the wooden floor, a slow, deliberate sound, and Elira found herself smiling, despite the strangeness of it all. She did not know, as she banked the fire and settled onto her narrow bed, that the creature lying by her hearth was no ordinary wolf at all. She did not know that Golden Eyes belonged to a man who commanded the loyalty of every pack in the north, a man whose enemies believed him dead, a man who had not felt safe, truly safe, in longer than he could remember, until a clumsy, kind-hearted Omega had knelt beside him in the mud and refused to let him die alone. She only knew that somewhere in the space of a single terrifying, extraordinary afternoon, her small and lonely world had shifted, and she suspected, as she drifted toward sleep with the sound of the wolf's steady breathing filling her tiny cottage, that it would never quite shift back. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the crooked shutters she had never quite managed to fix, and deep in the shadowed trees beyond her fence, unseen eyes watched the thin trail of smoke rising from her chimney, and waited. Elira woke twice in the night, each time certain she had imagined the entire afternoon. Each time she found the great black shape still lying by her hearth, breathing slow and steady, the fire burned down to embers beside it. The second time she woke, she lay very still on her narrow bed and studied the creature from a distance, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. No natural wolf grew to such a size. No natural wolf's fur held that strange, shifting shimmer, silver one moment and black the next, depending on how the dying firelight touched it. She had heard stories, of course. Every Omega in every pack grew up hearing stories about the old bloodlines, about alphas so powerful their wolf forms dwarfed ordinary shifters, about kings who ruled the northern packs with strength passed down through centuries. But those were stories meant for children, meant to explain why some alphas commanded more respect than others, not descriptions of anything she had ever expected to see with her own eyes. She pushed the thought away again, the way she had pushed it away earlier, and told herself that whatever this creature was, it needed rest more than it needed her curiosity. She closed her eyes, and, eventually, sleep found her again. When morning came, pale light spilling through the gaps in her shutters, Elira woke to an unfamiliar sound. It took her a moment to place it. The wolf was moving, slowly, testing its bandaged leg against the floorboards. She sat up quickly, brushing hair from her face, and found those golden eyes already fixed on her. "Good morning," she said, feeling suddenly foolish for speaking to an animal, as though it might answer. "How does the leg feel?" The wolf took a careful step, then another, favoring the injured limb, but managing to bear some weight on it. It was, Elira thought, a remarkably good sign. Wounds that deep usually took days before any weight could be placed on them at all, yet here the creature was, barely 12 hours after she had pulled iron teeth from its flesh, already testing its strength. She rose from her bed and began the small rituals of her morning, the ones she performed whether or not anyone was watching. She fed the fire. She fetched water. She checked on the handful of chickens that scratched in the yard behind her cottage, relieved to find them undisturbed, and returned inside to find the wolf watching the door with an intensity that made her pause. "You want to go outside?" she said. It was not really a question. She opened the door, and the wolf limped past her into the pale morning light, sniffing at the air, turning its great head toward the tree line beyond her fence, as though listening for something she could not hear. For a long moment, Elira was certain it would simply walk away, disappear back into the forest it had come from, and she was surprised by the small twist of disappointment that thought brought with it. But the wolf did not leave. It circled her small garden once, testing its leg, then returned to the doorway and sat, watching her, with an expression she could only describe as patient. "You're staying then," she said, and something in her chest, something she did not examine too closely, felt lighter for it. She spent the morning as she spent most mornings, mending a torn shirt for old Nora Whitfield down the lane, tending her small garden, feeding the chickens twice because she forgot she had already done it once. The wolf followed her through each task, lying in patches of sunlight, watching with those golden eyes, as she tripped over a garden hoe and nearly dropped an entire basket of eggs. When she stumbled, the wolf's ears flattened, and it rose halfway to its feet before catching itself, as though it had meant to catch her, and remembered, too late, that it had no hands to do so. "I'm always like this," she told it, gathering the eggs that had scattered but not broken, laughing despite herself. "You'll get used to it, if you plan on staying." By midday, she had grown almost comfortable with the strange arrangement. She spoke to the wolf as she worked, telling it small, unimportant things, how the herb garden had struggled after a hard frost, how the village baker sometimes traded bread for her mended clothes, how she had once tried to keep bees and been chased halfway across the field for her trouble. The wolf listened to all of it, with what seemed like genuine attention, and Elira found herself talking more freely than she had in years, as though the absence of a voice that could answer made it easier to say everything she had been holding inside. It was strange, she thought, how quickly fear could turn into something else entirely. Yesterday this creature had terrified her enough to make her consider running. Today she found herself glancing toward the door every few minutes, just to be sure it was still there, and something about that realization unsettled her more than the wolf itself ever had. In the late afternoon, as she knelt in her garden pulling weeds from around a row of struggling carrots, she heard the wolf let out a low, warning growl, so different from any sound it had made before that she froze immediately. She turned to see its hackles raised, its body angled toward the tree line, ears pinned flat against its skull. "What is it?" she whispered, though she knew it could not answer. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The forest stood silent and still, and Elira strained her eyes against the shadows between the trees, seeing nothing but leaves and darkness. Then, as quickly as it had come, the wolf's tension eased. It shook its great head, gave one last look toward the trees, and returned to its place near her garden, though something in its posture remained watchful for the rest of the day. Elira did not know what had startled it, and the wolf, of course, could not tell her. But that night, as she banked the fire and prepared for sleep, she found herself glancing at the door more than once, checking that the bolt was firmly in place, feeling for the first time in a long while that her small, quiet cottage might not be as invisible to the wider world as she had always believed. She fell asleep to the sound of the wolf's steady breathing, and did not know that somewhere beyond the tree line, riders in dark cloaks had passed through Thornwood Hollow that very afternoon, searching the forest paths for any sign of their missing king. 3 days passed in this strange, quiet rhythm, and with each one, Elira grew less afraid and more curious about the creature sharing her hearth. The wound on the wolf's leg was healing faster than she thought possible. By the second day, the swelling had gone down enough that she could change the bandage without the animal flinching. By the third, it walked with barely a limp at all, testing its weight on the leg with growing confidence as it paced the small perimeter of her garden each morning. She had tended enough injured animals in her life to know that healing at this speed was not natural, not for a wound that deep, not in 3 short days. But she had also learned, in 3 short days, that very little about this wolf was natural at all. She noticed other things too, small details that gathered in the back of her mind, like pebbles in a stream. The way the wolf's eyes seemed to sharpen with understanding whenever she spoke, far beyond what any ordinary animal should manage. The way it angled its body toward her whenever she moved through the cottage, as though positioning itself between her and the door without her ever asking it to. The way it had begun, just that morning, to nudge open the low chest where she kept her firewood, carrying logs to the hearth one at a time in its great jaws, as if it understood exactly what she needed before she asked for it. "You're not just a wolf," she said to it one evening, setting down her mending to study the creature more closely. "I don't know what you are, but you're not just a wolf." The wolf held her gaze for a long moment, and something in its golden eyes seemed almost sorrowful, as though it wished it could explain itself, and simply could not find the way. She thought, more than once, about the old stories her grandmother used to tell before the pack had cast her out. Stories about shifters, whose wolf forms grew large and powerful, in direct relation to the strength of the bloodline they carried. Stories about a line of alpha kings in the far north, whose wolves were said to be nearly the size of the horses their enemies rode into battle against them. She had always assumed those stories were exaggerations, the kind of tales meant to inspire awe in pups too young to know better. Now, watching this enormous black creature curl itself carefully around her small fireplace, taking up nearly the entire hearth with room to spare, she was no longer so certain. But if this truly was some great and powerful creature, some alpha of considerable standing, she could not begin to guess why it had ended up alone in a hunter's trap at the edge of her forest, injured and far from any pack that might have protected it. Powerful creatures did not typically wander into common traps meant for foxes and small game. Powerful creatures did not typically end up bleeding and abandoned in the woods behind a cottage belonging to a rejected Clumsy Omega, with nothing to offer but bandages and quiet company. Something had happened to this wolf, something it could not tell her, and something she suspected she did not particularly want to know the details of, given the careful, watchful way it studied the tree line each evening, as though still expecting danger to emerge from the shadows. On the fourth morning, she woke to find the wolf already awake, sitting upright near the door, staring intently at nothing Illyra could see or hear. She dressed quickly and joined it, kneeling beside its great shoulder, following its gaze toward the quiet, empty forest. "Is something out there?" she asked. The wolf's ears twitched, but it did not growl the way it had days before. Instead, it simply continued watching, patient and alert, until finally it turned back to her and let out a soft breath, almost like reassurance. She decided, after that, not to press the matter further. Whatever secrets this creature carried were its own, and she had learned long ago, from her own painful history, that some things were easier to bear when no one demanded explanations before you were ready to give them. Instead, she busied herself with the small, ordinary tasks of her life, tasks that had once felt lonely, and now felt, unexpectedly, less so. She fetched water from the well, and the wolf walked beside her, close enough that its shoulder occasionally brushed against her leg. She hung laundry on the crooked line strung between two trees, and the wolf lay in the grass nearby, watching with what she had come to recognize as quiet contentment. She visited old Nora Whitfield in the village to deliver a mended dress, leaving the wolf hidden in the trees at the edge of the property, and returned to find it exactly where she had left it, patient as a shadow. It was on her walk back from the village that she first noticed she was being watched by something other than the wolf. The feeling came suddenly, a prickle at the back of her neck that made her slow her steps and glance over her shoulder. The path behind her stood empty, lined with familiar trees and the soft afternoon light filtering through the leaves, and yet the sensation of being observed did not fade. She quickened her pace toward home, her basket of empty jars bouncing against her hip, and did not fully relax until she saw the black shape of the wolf rise to meet her at the edge of her property, its golden eyes immediately sweeping past her to scan the trees she had just walked through. "Did you feel that too?" she asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. The wolf's hackles were raised again, its body tense and alert, in a way that made Illyra's own heart begin to race. It moved past her, positioning itself between her and the path, and stood there for a long, silent minute, watching the shadows with an intensity that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that something dangerous had indeed been near. That night, Illyra barred her door more carefully than she had in years, checking the bolt twice, before finally settling into bed. The wolf did not sleep by the hearth as it had every night before. Instead, it positioned itself directly beside the door, facing outward, its great body a wall between whatever waited in the dark, and the small, sleeping Omega, who had saved its life. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, thinking about golden eyes and healing wounds, and the strange, watchful tension that had settled over her cottage like a held breath. She thought about the riders she had glimpsed from a distance days before, the dark cloaks moving between the trees, the way she had told herself they were simply travelers passing through and nothing more. She was no longer certain that was true. Somewhere in the depths of that long night, she finally understood, without anyone telling her directly, that the creature sleeping by her door was not merely recovering from an injury. It was hiding, and whatever it was hiding from had not given up the search. The realization should have frightened her more than it did. A sensible person, she thought, would have been terrified to discover that a hunted creature of enormous size and mysterious power had taken shelter in their home, drawing unknown danger closer with every day it remained. But as she watched the great black shape guarding her door, its breathing slow and steady, despite its obvious vigilance, she felt something closer to determination than fear. Whatever this wolf was running from, it had trusted her enough to stay. It had let her clean its wounds with clumsy, shaking hands. It had carried firewood for her hearth and walked beside her on quiet errands, and positioned its own body as a shield the moment danger drew near. She did not know its name. She did not know its true form, if it even had one beyond the wolf she had come to know. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was not going to turn it away simply because keeping it safe might prove more difficult than she had first imagined. "Whatever happens," she whispered into the darkness, unsure if the wolf was even awake to hear her, "you don't have to face it alone anymore." The wolf's ear flicked toward the sound of her voice, and though it did not turn from its watch at the door, its tail moved once against the floor, slow and deliberate, and Alira understood, in the strange, silent language they had built between them over these short days, that it had heard her, and that it was grateful. The following 2 days passed with a tension that had not existed before, though little on the surface seemed to change. Alira still rose early to tend her garden. She still fetched water and mended clothes, and fed her small flock of chickens. But now she moved with a new awareness, glancing toward the tree line more often than she used to, listening for footsteps that were not her own. The wolf never strayed far from her side during those 2 days. It walked with her to the edge of her property, and no farther, always positioning itself so it could see both her and the path beyond, as though torn between two duties it refused to abandon. She noticed, too, that it had stopped resting during the day the way it once had. Instead, it sat watchful near whatever task she performed, ears constantly shifting toward distant sounds, muscles coiled and ready even in stillness. On the 6th evening, as Alira prepared a small supper of bread and dried vegetables, she found herself speaking to the wolf again, filling the quiet cottage with words the way she always did when her nerves needed somewhere to go. "I used to think being alone out here was the worst thing that ever happened to me," she admitted, tearing a piece of bread and setting it near the wolf's paws, though she suspected he preferred meat to bread and simply tolerated her offering out of politeness. "My pack said I was too much trouble to keep around. Too slow, too clumsy. They said an Omega who could not even carry water without spilling it was no use to anyone." The wolf's golden eyes lifted to hers, steady and attentive, and something in that gaze made her continue. "I believed them, for a long time," she said quietly. "I thought maybe they were right, that I really was more burden than help, but then you came, and somehow, despite everything, I have not dropped a single bandage on you yet." She meant it as a small joke, a way to lighten the heaviness that had settled over the cottage since the riders passed through, but the wolf's response surprised her. It shifted closer, resting its great head gently against her knee, careful of its size, careful of its strength, in a gesture so tender that Alira felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "You don't think I'm a burden," she said softly, understanding the gesture for what it was. "You actually don't." The wolf made a low, rumbling sound in its chest, something between a sigh and a hum, and Alira found herself smiling, despite the fear that had followed her through the past 2 days, like a shadow she could not quite shake. That night, after the fire had burned low and the cottage had gone quiet, Alira lay in her narrow bed and thought about the strange turns her life had taken in less than a week. She thought about how easily she might have walked past that hunter's trap, might have told herself the sound she heard was only the wind, might have hurried home and never known what waited in the trees. She thought about how different her life might look now if fear had won out over the strange, stubborn kindness that had pulled her forward instead. She did not regret her choice, even with danger drawing closer, even with unknown riders searching the forest for reasons she could only guess at. She found she did not regret kneeling beside that enormous, wounded creature and choosing to help rather than run. Whatever came next, she thought, drifting slowly towards sleep, she would face it having finally done something that mattered, something that made her feel less like the clumsy failure her old pack had discarded, and more like a person capable of changing the outcome of another creature's story. The wolf settled by the door again that night, as it had every night since the riders passed through, and Alira slept more soundly than she expected, comforted by the steady rhythm of its breathing, and the quiet certainty that, for now at least, she was not facing whatever came next alone. On the 7th morning, everything changed. Alira woke before dawn to a sound she had never heard inside her cottage before, a sound like bones, shifting and stretching, low groans that seemed to belong to no creature she recognized. She sat up quickly, heart pounding, and in the dim gray light filtering through her shutters, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The wolf was no longer a wolf. Where the great black creature had lain only moments before, a man now knelt on her cottage floor, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, his skin pale in the early light, dark hair falling across a face carved with sharp, striking angles. A thick scar ran along one side of his ribs, the same place, Alira realized with a jolt, where she had bandaged the wolf's deepest wound. He was breathing hard, as though the change itself had cost him a great deal of strength, and for a moment he simply knelt there, head bowed, gathering himself. Alira did not scream, though every instinct told her she should have. She pressed herself back against the wall behind her bed instead, one hand flying to cover her mouth, staring at the stranger who had somehow appeared inside her locked cottage, in the exact place her wolf had been sleeping, only seconds before. "You," she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the wolf." The man's head lifted, and there, unmistakable even on an entirely different face, were the same striking golden eyes that had watched her from the forest floor a week ago. Recognition passed between them, quiet and undeniable, and something in his gaze softened when it landed on her, though his expression remained guarded, careful, like a man unsure of his welcome. "I am," he said, and his voice was deep and rough, unused, as though it had been a long time since he had spoken with anything but a wolf's silence. "My name is Kale." Alira's mind raced through everything she had witnessed over the past week, every strange detail that had gathered like pebbles in a stream, and now, finally, arranged themselves into a picture she could understand. The unnatural size, the speed of healing that should not have been possible, the watchfulness, the intelligence in eyes that seemed to understand far more than any ordinary animal could. She had suspected, in the quiet corners of her mind, that this creature was something more than a common wolf, but she had never imagined the truth would look like this, would look like a man whose presence alone seemed to fill the small cottage with a weight and gravity she had never felt from anyone before. "You should have told me," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized how foolish they sounded. He had not exactly had a way to explain himself while trapped in wolf form. "I mean, I didn't know. I bathed you. I cleaned your wounds. I talked to you like you were a pet." A faint, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen from him in either form. "You saved my life," he said simply. "There is no shame in how you did it." Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassment mixing uncomfortably with relief, and something else she could not quite name. She had spent a week speaking freely to this man, sharing quiet confessions about her past, about her rejection from her pack, about fears she had never voiced to another living soul, all while believing she was speaking to an animal who could not understand a single word. Now she understood, with a rush of mortification, that he had heard everything, had understood every word, and had chosen to stay silent through all of it. "How long have you been able to speak?" she asked, gathering what dignity she could manage, while still huddled against her own wall in her nightclothes. "Since the moment you found me," he admitted. "Shifting back required more strength than I had. My body needed time to heal before it could manage the change. Until this morning, I was truly trapped as I appeared." "So you heard everything," she said, more statement than question, dread pooling low in her stomach. "I did," Kale said, and something careful entered his expression, as though he understood exactly how vulnerable she must feel in this moment. And I want you to know that nothing you said to me was wasted on deaf ears. I heard every word, and I meant every sound I made in response, even if I could not speak them back to you the way I wished I could. Elira did not know what to say to that. She sat frozen against her wall, studying this stranger, who was somehow also the creature she had come to trust over the past week, trying to reconcile the two in her mind. He carried himself with an authority she had rarely encountered, a stillness and control that suggested a man accustomed to command, to being obeyed without question. Even wounded, even exhausted from the effort of shifting, he knelt on her floor with the bearing of someone far more important than any wounded traveler had a right to be. "Who are you?" she asked finally. "Truly. Not just your name." Kale was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet held her in place all the same. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Pax," he said finally, and the words seemed to settle into the small cottage like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Elira thought she understood about the week she had just lived through. "I was ambushed by rivals, seeking to claim my territory. They caught me in wolf form, weakened me enough that I could not fight my way free, and left me for dead in a hunter's trap they knew I would be too injured to escape." Elira stared at him, the pieces of the past week rearranging themselves once more in her mind. The riders in dark cloaks, the wolf's constant vigilance, the way it had positioned itself between her and the door each night, guarding not only its own safety but hers as well. She had been sheltering a king. She, a rejected Omega with a crooked fence and a leaking roof, had pulled the ruler of the Northern Pax from a hunter's trap and nursed him back to health with nothing more than well water and torn cloth. "You're a king," she repeated slowly, as though saying it aloud might make it easier to believe. "I am," he confirmed. "And you saved my life without knowing it, without asking anything in return, at considerable risk to your own safety." Elira felt suddenly, acutely aware of the state of her cottage, the thin blankets on her narrow bed, the mended dress hanging by the door, the modest and imperfect life she had built for herself, at the edge of a hollow most people preferred to forget existed. This man, this king, had been lying on her floor for a week, watching her stumble through chores and speak to him, as though he were nothing more than an animal, and now he knelt here, with the weight of an entire kingdom behind his golden eyes, and she had no idea what to say to him. "You should rest," she managed finally, falling back on the only certainty she had left, the one thing she knew how to do regardless of who stood, or knelt, in front of her. "Shifting clearly cost you a great deal of strength. Whatever else is true, you're still healing." Something shifted in Kale's expression at that, a flicker of surprise, perhaps, or something gentler than surprise. Most people, upon learning they have been harboring a king in their home, ask a great many questions before concerning themselves with his comfort, he said. "Most people probably haven't spent a week convincing themselves a giant wolf understood their jokes," Elira replied, and to her own surprise, a small laugh escaped her, equal parts nerves and genuine amusement at the absurdity of the entire situation. Kale's answering smile was slow, but it reached his eyes in a way that made Elira's breath catch unexpectedly. "I understood every one," he said, "even the terrible ones about my tail getting in your way." Heat rushed to her cheeks again, and she busied herself rising from the bed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, focusing on anything other than the way his gaze followed her movements, with an attention that felt entirely different, now that she understood the man behind it. "I'll bring you water," she said, needing something to do with her hands, needing a moment to gather her scattered thoughts. "And something to eat, if you can manage it. You'll need your strength if those riders are still searching for you." Kale's expression sobered instantly at the mention of the riders, the warmth in his eyes, replaced by something sharper, more alert. "How many did you see?" "I don't know, a handful, maybe more, passing through the forest paths a few days ago. Dark cloaks. They didn't stop, but I felt watched more than once since then." Kale's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he had shifted, Elira saw the king beneath the man, saw the calculating awareness of someone accustomed to assessing threats and planning around them. "They are still searching," he said quietly. "Which means they have not yet found what they were looking for. That is good. It means we still have time. Time for what? Alira asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. Time for me to heal enough to defend this place properly, Kale said, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. You pulled me from a trap and gave me shelter without asking for anything in return. I do not intend to repay that kindness by bringing danger to your door and then abandoning you to face it alone. Alira opened her mouth to argue, to insist that he owed her nothing, that he should focus on returning to wherever kings belonged, rather than lingering in a crooked cottage at the edge of a forgotten hollow. But something in the quiet certainty of his expression made the words die on her tongue, and instead, she found herself simply nodding, accepting, for now, that whatever came next, they would face it together. She turned to fetch water as promised, her mind still spinning with everything the morning had revealed, and did not see the way Kale watched her go, his golden eyes softening with something that looked, though he had not yet found the words for it himself, remarkably like the beginning of gratitude turning slowly, carefully, into something warmer still. By midday, Kale had eaten a small meal and slept for several hours in the chair by the fire, insisting he did not need her narrow bed and refusing to hear any argument on the matter. When he woke, color had returned to his face, and though he still moved carefully, favoring the ribs where his deepest wound had been, he seemed steadier than Alira had expected after witnessing the toll the shift had taken on him that morning. You should go home, she said, setting a bowl of stew beside him, though the words felt strange in her mouth even as she spoke them. Wherever your pack is, they must be searching for you too, and surely it's safer for you to be surrounded by your own people than hiding in a cottage at the edge of nowhere. Kale studied her for a long moment before answering, his golden eyes carrying a weight she was beginning to recognize as the look of a man choosing his words with great care. My pack believes I am dead, he said finally. The rivals who ambushed me spread word of my death within a day, hoping to seize control of northern territory before any resistance could organize. If I return now, weakened and without proof of what happened, I walk into a court already reshaping itself around the assumption that I am gone. I need to heal further, and I need to gather proof of who betrayed me, before I can safely reveal myself again. So you're staying, Alira said slowly, understanding dawning. If you will permit it, Kale said, and something in his tone suggested this was not a request he made lightly, nor one he expected to be granted easily. I know I have already imposed on your kindness, far beyond what any stranger deserves, but I have nowhere else I can go that would not put my recovery, and likely my life, at greater risk than remaining here. Alira thought of the crooked fence, the leaking roof, the single narrow bed she had already offered to give up without a second thought. She thought of the danger that had already begun circling her small property, the dark-cloaked riders searching paths she once walked without a single worry. Taking in an injured wolf had been a moment of instinct, a choice made before she fully understood its consequences. Choosing to shelter a king, knowingly, with all the danger that decision carried, was something else entirely. And yet, looking at him now, exhausted and vulnerable despite the authority that clung to him even in weakness, she found she could not imagine turning him away. You can stay, she said, until you're strong enough to face whatever comes next. But you'll have to help around here if you're going to eat my food and take up half my cottage. I won't have a king lounging about while I do all the work. For the first time since he had shifted, Kale laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that seemed to ease some of the tension from his broad shoulders. I have never once been asked to earn my keep, he admitted. I find I rather like the idea. True to her word, Alira put him to work the very next day, and true to his own, Kale did not complain, though it quickly became clear that a king who had spent his life commanding armies and negotiating with rival packs possessed almost no practical skills for cottage living. He split firewood with more enthusiasm than technique, sending splinters flying in every direction, until Alira, laughing despite herself, showed him the proper angle to strike the wood. He attempted to mend the fence, and somehow made it lean even further than before, prompting Alira to declare, with mock seriousness, that she would rather have a crooked fence built by her own clumsy hands than a crooked fence built by his. I have led armies into battle, Kale said one afternoon, staring in genuine confusion at a length of rope he had somehow tangled into an impossible knot while attempting to help her hang laundry. I have negotiated treaties between packs who have hated each other for generations. And yet I cannot manage to hang a single shirt on a line without turning it into this. Some skills simply aren't taught to kings, I suppose, Illyra said, taking the rope from his hands and working the knot free with practiced fingers. Apparently not, Cale agreed, watching her hands with an attention that made her suddenly, acutely aware of how close he stood, of the warmth radiating from him, despite the cool afternoon air. Days passed in this manner, filled with small mishaps and quiet laughter that neither of them had expected to find in the middle of such uncertain circumstances. Illyra, true to her nature, dropped things constantly, tripped over roots and furniture with impressive regularity, and burned more than one meal while distracted by conversation. But where her old pack had seen only failure in these moments, Cale seemed to find something closer to delight, always quick to catch whatever she dropped when he could, always quicker still to laugh with her, rather than at her when he could not. "You do that on purpose," she accused him one evening, after he had somehow managed to catch a falling pot before it hit the ground, moving with a speed that reminded her, briefly and unsettlingly, of exactly how dangerous he truly was, beneath the easy warmth he had shown her all week. "You're testing whether I'll trust you to catch things. I promise you, I am simply faster than most people," Cale said, setting the pot gently on the table. "Though I confess, I have grown rather fond of watching you work. There is an honesty in it I do not often encounter." "An honesty in dropping pots?" Illyra asked, raising an eyebrow. "An honesty in being exactly who you are, without pretense," Cale said, and something in the quiet sincerity of his tone made the teasing smile fade from her lips. "In my world, everyone performs. Every gesture is calculated, every word measured for effect. You have never once measured anything around me. You simply are who you are, clumsy hands and quick laughter and all, and I find I have missed that kind of honesty more than I realized." Illyra did not know how to respond to that, so instead she busied herself with the abandoned pot, scraping burnt vegetables into a bowl for the chickens, feeling Cale's gaze on her the entire time, warm and steady, and entirely too observant for her own comfort. That night, after the fire had burned low, and Cale had once again insisted on taking the chair rather than her bed, Illyra lay awake longer than usual, thinking about honesty and pretense, and the strange, unexpected comfort of being seen clearly by someone for the very first time in her life. Her old pack had seen only her mistakes. The villagers who traded with her saw only a useful pair of hands for mending clothes. But Cale, this king who had every reason in the world to see her as beneath him, seemed to see something else entirely, something she had not realized she was starving for, until he offered it so freely. She fell asleep to the quiet sound of his breathing across the small cottage, and did not notice, in the depths of that peaceful rest, the way Cale watched the ceiling, long after she had drifted off, turning over in his mind the growing certainty that whatever healing he had come here seeking, it was no longer only his body that had begun to mend. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since Illyra first found Cale tangled in that hunter's trap, and the changes in him were remarkable. His strength had returned fully. The scar along his ribs had faded from an angry red to a thin, pale line. He moved now with the easy, coiled power of a man fully recovered, and though he still helped with the small chores of her cottage, Illyra noticed a new restlessness settling into him, a watchfulness that reminded her, more than she liked, of the wolf who had once guarded her door each night against threats she could not see. It was on a gray, overcast morning that the restlessness finally found its cause. Illyra had walked to the village to trade a mended coat for a small sack of flour, leaving Cale, as always, hidden in the trees at the edge of her property. She was halfway home, her basket lighter than she expected, when she noticed 2 men standing near the crossroads outside the village, speaking in low voices with old Nora Whitfield, who had always struck Illyra as far too clever to be easily fooled by anyone. Something about the men made her slow her steps. They wore fine cloaks despite the mud of the road, cloaks lined with a deep gray fur that marked them as belonging to a pack of some standing, though not one Illyra recognized. She caught only fragments of their conversation as she passed, careful not to seem as though she were listening. "Searching every settlement within 3 days' ride of Thornwood," one man was saying. "Lord Voss believes the king may have taken shelter with a local pack, if he survived the ambush at all." "And if he is found?" Nora asked, her tone carefully neutral in a way that made Illyra's stomach twist with sudden fear. Then Lord Voss will finally claim what should have been his from the start, the second man said, a hard edge entering his voice. The northern territories belong under stronger leadership than a king soft enough to be caught unaware by his own rivals. Illyra did not linger to hear more. She quickened her pace toward home, her heart hammering against her ribs, the flour sack bouncing painfully against her hip with every hurried step. By the time she reached her cottage, she was nearly running, and Cale met her at the edge of the tree line before she had even crossed the fence, alarm already written across his features. "What happened?" he asked, gripping her shoulders gently, his golden eyes searching her face. "There were men at the crossroads," she gasped, catching her breath, wearing gray fur, asking questions about a king who might have survived and taken shelter nearby. "They mentioned someone called Lord Voss." Cale's expression darkened instantly, all the warmth of the past 2 weeks replaced by something cold and sharp, something that reminded Illyra, once again, exactly how dangerous the man standing before her truly was. "Voss," he said, the name coming out like a curse. "He was among the rivals who ambushed me. I should have suspected he would lead the search himself, rather than trust it to lesser men." "They're searching every settlement within 3 days' ride," Illyra said. "That includes Thornwood Hollow." "Then we do not have much time," Cale said, releasing her shoulders, and turning his gaze toward the forest, his whole body tense, with the particular stillness she had come to recognize as calculation. A king assessing threats, and planning his response, with the speed of long practice. "I need to move quickly, before their search grows more thorough." "Move where?" Illyra asked, a knot of dread forming in her stomach at the thought of him leaving, a feeling that surprised her with its intensity, even as she recognized how foolish it was to feel anything but relief at the idea of danger moving away from her small cottage. "I am not leaving you," Cale said, as though reading the fear behind her question with an accuracy that startled her. "But I cannot simply wait here for Voss's men to stumble upon this cottage. I need information. I need to know how far his search has spread, and whether any of my own loyal packmates have begun to suspect the truth of what happened to me." "That sounds dangerous," Illyra said. "Everything about my current situation is dangerous," Cale replied, though something in his tone gentled as he looked at her, some acknowledgement of the fear he could clearly see in her expression. "But I promise you, I do not intend to be caught unaware a second time. I have learned, this past fortnight, exactly how much I have to lose." Illyra understood, from the weight in his golden eyes as he said it, that he was not speaking only of his kingdom. That evening, after a tense supper eaten mostly in silence, Cale explained his plan. He would shift and travel under the cover of darkness, moving through the forest paths he knew better than anyone hunting him, gathering information from the few packmates he trusted enough to approach without revealing his location. He would return before dawn, before anyone had reason to notice his absence, and they would use whatever he learned to decide their next steps. "I don't like this," Illyra admitted, watching him prepare, if preparation could be called anything more than simply steeling himself for the shift. "I don't particularly like it either," Cale said, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. "But I like the alternative far less. I will not sit idle in your cottage while Voss's men close in around us, waiting for danger to find us, rather than meeting it on my own terms." "Just come back," Illyra said, and the words came out more raw than she intended, more honest than she had meant to allow herself to be. Cale's expression softened at that, something warm and searching passing between them in the quiet cottage. "I will," he said. "You have my word, and a king's word is not given lightly." He shifted then, the transformation quicker and less painful than it had been the first time she witnessed it, his body reshaping itself into the enormous black wolf she had first found tangled in iron teeth, though now that shape carried none of the weakness it had that first terrible day. He paused at the door, golden eyes finding hers one final time, and then he was gone, disappearing into the dark forest with a speed that took her breath away. Illyra did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire, mending clothes she did not need to mend, simply to keep her hands busy, listening to every sound the wind carried through her crooked shutters, praying to whatever spirits watched over foolish, clumsy Omegas, that the wolf she had come to care for far more than she had ever intended, would return to her safely before the sun rose. Hours passed. The fire burned low, then lower still, and Illyra's mending fell forgotten into her lap as exhaustion finally began to pull at her, despite her best efforts to stay alert. It was in the deepest, darkest hour of the night, when hope had begun to feel thinner than she wanted to admit, that she heard a soft scratch at her door. She rose so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair, crossing the cottage in a few clumsy steps and throwing the bolt free. The great black wolf stood on her doorstep, breathing hard, one shoulder bearing a fresh scrape that had not been there before, but alive, and whole, and home. "You're hurt," she said, pulling him inside, already reaching for cloth and water, despite the relief flooding through her chest. The wolf shifted back before she could tend the wound, folding into the familiar shape of the man she had come to know these past 2 weeks, and this time, when he knelt on her floor, exhaustion written plainly across his features, Elira did not hesitate before wrapping her arms around him, careful of the scrape on his shoulder, careful and fierce all at once. "I was so worried," she admitted into his shoulder, feeling him go still with surprise before his arms rose slowly, carefully, to return the embrace. "I know," Cale said quietly, his voice rough with something that was not entirely exhaustion. "I am sorry to have caused you such worry. But I learned what I needed to know." "What did you find?" Elira asked, finally pulling back enough to look at him, though she did not step entirely out of the circle of his arms. Cale's expression turned grim. "Voss has convinced much of the northern court that I am truly dead. He moves to formalize his claim to the throne within the fortnight. My most loyal packmates believe the same, and mourn me even now, which means I have very little time to gather proof of the ambush and return before his claim becomes impossible to challenge." "What kind of proof?" Elira asked. "A witness," Cale said. "One of the men who ambushed me survives, wounded, and hiding from Voss's own justice, for reasons I do not yet fully understand. If I can find him, and convince him to speak against Voss before the court, I can reclaim my throne, and end this danger to us both." "Us," Elira repeated softly, and something in the way Cale's golden eyes met hers, steady and certain despite everything, told her that word had not been chosen carelessly. "Us," Cale confirmed. "Because whatever comes next, Elira, I do not intend to face it without you beside me, if you will permit that." Elira did not have an answer ready for that, not yet, not with the weight of everything they still faced pressing down around them. But she found, as she finally turned her attention to the scrape on his shoulder, cleaning it with the same careful hands that had tended his wounds from the very first day, that she did not want to imagine facing whatever came next without him either. Outside, the wind continued to move through the trees, carrying with it the distant, unheard sound of riders, drawing their search circles steadily, patiently, closer to the small crooked cottage at the edge of Thornwood Hollow. In the days that followed, the quiet rhythm of the cottage changed once more, though this time the shift carried an urgency neither of them tried to hide. Cale spent long hours studying a rough map he had sketched from memory, marking the paths Voss's men were most likely to search next, tracing routes toward the hidden camp, where the wounded survivor of his ambush was rumored to be recovering. "You cannot go alone," Elira said one evening, watching him fold the map with the careful precision of a man preparing for a journey he had already decided upon. "If Voss's men find you traveling that road, you'll have no one to help you." "I have traveled alone since the day I inherited my throne," Cale said, though his tone lacked its usual certainty. "It is safer for you to remain here, away from danger." "Safer for me, perhaps," Elira said, setting down the bowl she had been drying with more force than strictly necessary. "But you said yourself that Voss's men are searching every settlement nearby. Do you truly believe this cottage remains safe, simply because you are not standing in it?" Cale's jaw tightened, and Elira could see the argument forming behind his eyes, even before he spoke it. "If something happened to you because of me, I would never forgive myself. And if something happens to you because you insisted on facing this alone, do you imagine I would simply forgive myself either?" Elira countered, surprising herself with the fierceness in her own voice. For a long moment, Cale said nothing, simply studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, warm, and searching, and faintly astonished, as though she continued to surprise him in ways he had stopped expecting from anyone. "You are a remarkably stubborn Omega," he said finally, though the words carried no sting, only a kind of reluctant admiration. "I have been called worse," Elira said, "usually by my old pack, and usually right before they reminded me how little use they had for stubbornness in someone who could not carry a bucket without spilling it. Their loss appears to have become my gain, Cale said quietly, and something in the simple sincerity of the statement made Alira's chest tighten with an emotion she was still not entirely ready to name. In the end, they compromised, as they had learned to do over these strange weeks of shared danger and unexpected companionship. Alira would not travel the dangerous roads with him, but she would help him prepare, gathering supplies and information from the village that a wolf traveling alone could not easily collect. She visited old Nora Whitfield again the following morning, this time listening far more carefully to the older Omega's words, and returned with news that made Cale's expression turn grave. Voss has doubled the number of men searching this region, she reported, setting a small sack of provisions on the table. Nora says they've begun questioning villagers directly now, not simply passing through. She thinks they suspect Thornwood Hollow specifically, though she doesn't know why. They may have found evidence of my passage through the forest during my scouting, Cale said grimly. A single misstep and I have brought Voss's full attention down upon the one place I most needed to remain hidden. Then we need to move faster, Alira said, before they start searching individual properties. Cale studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his golden eyes. We, he repeated softly, you keep including yourself in danger that was never meant to touch you. It touched me the moment I pulled you out of that trap, Alira said simply. I don't regret that choice, and I'm not about to start pretending I can simply step back from its consequences now. That night, they worked together late into the evening, Cale sharing what he knew of the terrain, Alira offering knowledge of the local villages and the hidden paths only someone who had lived at the edge of the forest for years would recognize. It was during this planning, hunched together over a rough map by firelight, their shoulders nearly touching, that Alira became aware of just how close Cale had drawn to her, without either of them quite noticing the shift. There, she said, pointing to a bend in the river she knew well. This crossing is shallow enough to ford quietly, and it's rarely watched because most travelers use the bridge further south. How do you know terrain this well? Cale asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice, not the careful, measured tone of a king assessing information, but something warmer, more personal. I used to walk these paths often, before, Alira admitted, when I still hoped someone from my old pack might come looking for me, might realize casting me out had been a mistake. I learned every hidden crossing and quiet path in this forest, waiting for a reunion that never came. Cale was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight she had not expected. Their loss, he said again, echoing his earlier words, grows more foolish to me, with every day I spend in your company. Alira looked up from the map to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his golden eyes holding none of the careful distance he usually maintained, only something open and honest, and entirely undisguised. Cale, she started, though she was not entirely certain what she meant to say next. I know this is not the time, he said quietly, before she could find her words. With Voss's men closing in, and my throne hanging in uncertain balance, I know I should be entirely focused on the dangers ahead. But I find, Alira, that I cannot look at you without acknowledging what has grown between us these past weeks, regardless of how inconvenient the timing may be. What has grown between us? Alira repeated softly, testing the words. Something I did not expect to find, Cale admitted. Something I have never found with anyone else, not among the highest-ranking Omegas of my own court, not among any I was once expected to consider as a match. You saw a wounded, frightened creature caught in a trap, and instead of running, instead of calling for hunters to finish what the ambush started, you knelt in the mud and chose kindness. I do not think you understand how rare that choice truly is. Alira felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though whether from the weight of his words or the accumulated exhaustion and fear of the past weeks, she could not entirely say. I only did what felt right, she said. I never expected it to lead to any of this. Neither did I, Cale said, reaching out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. And yet here we are. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, the weight of everything still unresolved, the danger still gathering beyond the crooked walls of her cottage, holding them both in careful suspension. But something had shifted between them all the same. an acknowledgement neither could take back, and when they finally returned to planning the dangerous road ahead, they did so with their hands resting close together on the worn wooden table, fingers not quite touching, but no longer entirely apart either. They worked until the fire burned low, until exhaustion finally demanded rest, and when Kale once again insisted on the chair rather than her narrow bed, Elira found herself, for the first time, wishing he had chosen differently. She fell asleep with that thought still turning quietly in her mind, unaware that across the small cottage, Kale lay awake far longer than she did, staring at the ceiling, and wondering how a king who had lost his throne, and nearly lost his life, had somehow, in the span of a few short weeks, found something he was far more afraid of losing than either. The morning came sooner than either of them wanted, gray light creeping through the shutters to signal the start of the journey Kale had delayed only long enough to prepare properly. Elira packed the small sack of provisions with hands that trembled slightly, refusing to let herself dwell too long on the danger he was about to walk into. "You'll be careful," she said, not quite a question, standing at the door as he made final preparations. "I have survived worse odds than this," Kale said, though the reassurance sounded thinner than he likely intended, "and I have far more reason to return safely now than I did before." He reached for her hand, before he could stop himself, and Elira did not pull away. For a long moment, they simply stood together in the doorway, the weight of everything unspoken between them settling into that single point of contact, until finally Kale pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, old-fashioned and formal, in a way that made her breath catch despite herself. "I will return," he said. "You have my word." He shifted at the edge of the tree line, the great black wolf disappearing into the forest with a speed that left Elira standing alone at her fence, watching the space where he had vanished long after there was nothing left to see. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than the last. Elira busied herself with chores she barely registered performing, her mind constantly returning to the dangerous road Kale traveled, to Lord Voss and his searching men, to a wounded survivor hidden somewhere in the northern territories who held the key to reclaiming a stolen throne. She fed her chickens twice without noticing, mended a shirt with stitches so uneven she eventually gave up and started again, and found herself, more than once, standing at her fence staring toward the forest, as though sheer will alone might hurry his return. It was in the late afternoon, as the light began its slow slide toward evening, that Elira first heard the sound of hooves on the path leading toward her cottage. Her heart leapt into her throat. She had grown so accustomed to the sound of Kale's paws against packed earth, to the particular rhythm of his approach, that any other sound now filled her with immediate, sharp alarm. She hurried inside and bolted the door, pressing herself against the wall beside the window, peering carefully through a gap in the shutters at the path beyond. 3 riders approached, their cloaks the same deep gray fur she had glimpsed on the men at the crossroads, their expressions hard and searching as they surveyed her small property with obvious purpose. Elira's breath caught in her chest. These were Voss's men, she was certain of it, and they had found their way directly to her door. She had no way to warn Kale. She had no way to know how far he had traveled, whether he could sense danger gathering at the cottage he had left behind, whether returning now would only walk him directly into the hands of the men who had already tried once to end his life. All she could do was stand very still, her back pressed against the rough wooden wall, and pray these riders would find nothing worth their suspicion. The knock at her door came sharp and demanding, 3 heavy raps that seemed to echo through the small cottage far louder than they should have. "Open this door," a voice called, cold and commanding, "in the name of Lord Voss, rightful claimant to the northern throne." Elira's mind raced. She could not simply refuse to answer, not without inviting suspicion that might prove far more dangerous than whatever these men currently intended. She smoothed her dress with shaking hands, arranged her features into what she hoped resembled ordinary confusion rather than terror, and pulled back the bolt. 3 men stood on her doorstep, their gray cloaks damp with the mist that had begun rolling in from the forest, their eyes sharp and assessing as they studied her small frame in the doorway. "Can I help you?" Elira asked, proud that her voice came out steadier than she felt. "We're searching for signs of an injured wolf," the lead rider said, his gaze moving past her into the cottage, scanning what little he could see from the doorway. Unusually large, black fur. "Have you seen any such creature in this area?" Alira's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain the men must be able to hear it. She thought of every lesson she had ever learned about deception, which amounted to almost nothing, having spent her entire life valued more for honesty than cunning. But she thought too of Cale's golden eyes, of his gentle kiss against her knuckles that very morning, of the promise he had made to return, and found, somewhere within herself, a steadiness she had not known she possessed. "I've heard the village talking about wolves in the area," she said carefully, choosing words that were technically true, without offering the information these men actually sought. "Though I've been too frightened to venture far into the forest myself. A woman alone can't be too careful." The lead rider's eyes studied her a moment longer, and Alira forced herself to hold his gaze, to project nothing but the mild concern of an ordinary Omega, troubled by rumors of dangerous wildlife. "If you see anything unusual," the rider said finally, "you are to report it immediately, to Lord Voss's men in the village. There is a substantial reward for information leading to the creature's location." "Of course," Alira said, "though I confess, I hope never to encounter something large enough to be called unusual in these woods." The rider gave a short, dismissive nod, apparently satisfied, and turned to survey her small property once more. His gaze lingered a moment too long on the crooked fence, on the worn path leading toward the well, and Alira held her breath, terrified he might notice some sign of Cale's presence she had failed to erase, some detail that might betray the truth she had just spent every ounce of her limited cunning to conceal. "We'll be searching this region thoroughly over the coming days," the rider said finally, turning his horse back toward the path. "If you think of anything else, or if that wolf shows itself near your property, you would be wise to send word immediately." The three riders departed as suddenly as they had arrived, their horses' hooves fading into the mist-heavy afternoon, and Alira remained frozen in her doorway long after they had disappeared from sight, her legs finally giving out beneath her, as the full weight of the encounter crashed over her at once. She sank onto her doorstep, hands trembling, breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps, and it was in this state, shaken and pale, that Cale found her nearly an hour later, emerging from the tree line at a dead run, his wolf form shifting to human, before he had even fully cleared the fence. "Alira," he called, alarm sharp in his voice, as he took in her huddled figure on the doorstep. "What happened? I felt something was wrong. I came as fast as I could." "Voss's men were here," Alira said, her voice still unsteady. "3 riders. They were asking about a large black wolf, offering a reward for information." Cale's face went pale beneath its usual color, and he knelt quickly beside her, gripping her hands in his own, checking her over with an intensity that suggested he was searching for injuries he could not immediately see. "Did they hurt you? Did they threaten you in any way?" "No," Alira said, shaking her head. "I told them I hadn't seen anything unusual, that I was too frightened to venture into the forest. I don't think they believed I was lying, but I don't know if that's enough. They said they would be searching this region thoroughly over the coming days." Cale's jaw tightened, fury and fear warring visibly across his features. "This is exactly what I feared," he said. "I have brought danger directly to your door, and now Voss's own men have marked this cottage as a place worth watching. I should never have allowed myself to remain here this long." "Don't," Alira said sharply, surprising them both with the force of her interruption. "Don't you dare start regretting the choice to stay. Not after everything we've built these past weeks. I chose this too, Cale. I chose to pull you from that trap. I chose to keep sheltering you once I knew who you truly were, and I choose now to help you face whatever comes next. That is not a burden you placed on me. It is a decision I made freely, and I would make it again without hesitation." Cale stared at her, something fierce and tender warring in his golden eyes, and then, without a word of warning, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, as though the mere thought of losing her had shaken loose every careful restraint he had maintained until now. "I found him," Cale said finally, his voice muffled against her hair. "The survivor. He agreed to speak against Voss before the Northern Court, but we must move quickly. Voss's suspicion is growing, and if his men return to search this cottage more thoroughly, they may find evidence I have been unable to entirely erase." "Then we go tonight," Alira said, pulling back to look at him, determination steadying her voice, despite the fear still trembling through her limbs. "Before they have a chance to return." Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between the practical wisdom of her suggestion and the fierce, protective instinct to keep her as far from danger as possible. Finally he nodded, some final decision settling into place behind his eyes. "Tonight then," he agreed. "But Alira, I need you to understand what we're walking into. Voss will not simply accept defeat if his claim to the throne is challenged. He will fight to keep what he believes is rightfully his, and that fight may become violent before it becomes just." "I understand," Alira said, though the words carried a weight she was only beginning to fully comprehend. "But I'd rather face that danger standing beside you than wait here alone, wondering if you'll ever return at all." Cale's expression softened, something achingly tender passing across his features as he reached up to cup her face gently in his hands. "You are the bravest person I have ever known," he said quietly. "Rejected by your own pack for clumsiness they mistook for weakness, and here you stand, ready to walk into the heart of a contested throne to help a king reclaim what was stolen from him. They lost something remarkable when they let you go, Alira. I intend to make certain I never make the same mistake." Alira did not have words ready for that, so instead she simply leaned into his touch, letting the warmth of his hands against her face steady the last of her trembling fear. And together, as evening settled fully over Thornwood Hollow, they began preparing for the dangerous journey that would determine the fate of a stolen kingdom and the fragile, precious future they had somehow found within it. They traveled through the night, keeping to the hidden paths Alira knew from her years of solitary wandering, avoiding the main roads where Voss's searching riders were most likely to patrol. Cale remained in wolf form for most of the journey, allowing Alira to ride upon his back when exhaustion threatened to slow their pace, his enormous size making the burden of carrying her negligible compared to the ground they needed to cover before dawn. It was during a brief rest, huddled together beneath the shelter of an ancient oak while Cale regained his human form to share a small meal, that the conversation turned, unexpectedly, back to the pack that had cast Alira out so many years before. "Tell me about them," Cale said quietly, watching her across the small fire they had risked lighting, carefully shielded from view. "Your old pack. I want to understand what kind of people could look at you and see nothing worth keeping." Alira was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over before finally answering. "My mother died when I was young, birthing a sibling who did not survive either. My father remarried within the year, and my new stepmother had little patience for a pup who could not seem to master even simple tasks without stumbling. I dropped things. I tripped over roots that everyone else somehow managed to avoid. I was slower than the other pups during training, always the last to finish, always the one the pack leader singled out for correction." "That sounds like simple childhood clumsiness," Cale said, frowning. "Every pup struggles with something during training." "That's what I told myself too, for a long time," Alira said. "But my stepmother convinced my father that my clumsiness reflected something deeper, some fundamental weakness that made me unfit to properly serve the pack as an Omega should. By the time I came of age, the pack leader had decided I brought more embarrassment than value, and I was cast out, sent to fend for myself at the edge of Thornwood Hollow, with little more than the clothes on my back and whatever meager skills I had managed to learn, despite their constant discouragement." Cale's expression had darkened steadily throughout her explanation, and by the time she finished, fury burned openly in his golden eyes. "They discarded you," he said, "not because you lacked worth, but because they lacked the patience to recognize it. That is not a failing in you, Alira. That is a failing in every single member of that pack who chose cruelty over understanding." "I've made peace with it," Alira said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized how thin that peace truly was, how deeply the old wounds still ached beneath years of careful acceptance. "It taught me to survive on my own. It taught me to be self-sufficient in ways I might never have learned otherwise. That does not make what they did to you acceptable," Cale said firmly. "You should never have needed to learn survival through abandonment. You deserved a pack that saw your clumsiness for what it truly was, an unremarkable trait, unrelated to your worth, and loved you regardless." Something in his fierce, unwavering certainty made tears prick unexpectedly at Alira's eyes. No one had ever spoken about her old pack's treatment of her with such open anger on her behalf, such immediate and unquestioning conviction that the fault lay entirely with them and not with her. "When this is over," Cale continued, his voice quieter now but no less intense, When Voss has been dealt with, and my throne properly restored, I want you to know that the life waiting for you, if you choose to share it with me, will be nothing like what you experienced with that pack. You will never again be made to feel that your worth depends on flawless performance of tasks that matter little in the end. You will be valued exactly as you are. Elira wiped at her eyes, embarrassed by the sudden rush of emotion, but unable to stop it entirely. You don't know that yet, she said softly. You're a king. Your court will have expectations of whoever stands beside you, expectations I may never be able to meet. My court will learn to value what I value, Cale said, with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had spent his life commanding obedience and expected no different in this matter. And what I value, Elira, is a woman brave enough to pull a wounded stranger from a trap despite her own fear, kind enough to tend his wounds without asking anything in return, and strong enough to stand before Voss's own men and protect his secret with nothing but her wits and her courage. That is worth infinitely more than flawless grace in a ballroom. They finished their meal in comfortable silence after that, the weight of Elira's past settling into something gentler, now that it had been shared and met with such fierce, protective understanding, rather than the dismissive judgment she had grown accustomed to expecting from anyone she confided in. As they prepared to continue their journey, Cale reached for her hand once more, threading his fingers through hers with a tenderness that had nothing hesitant about it, and Elira found herself, for the first time since her old pack's rejection, beginning to believe that perhaps her worth had never truly been in question at all. We should reach the survivor's hiding place by dawn, Cale said, helping her onto his back once he had shifted again, his voice carrying steadily through the strange, wordless connection they had built over these past weeks. Once we have his testimony secured, we travel to the northern court together. Voss will not expect a direct challenge, especially not one arriving with proof of his treachery in hand. Elira settled against his broad shoulders, drawing warmth from his powerful frame as the cold night air rushed past them, and allowed herself, despite the danger still ahead, a small measure of hope. Whatever waited at the northern court, whatever confrontation with Lord Voss still lay before them, she found she no longer faced it as the discarded, clumsy Omega her old pack had cast aside. She faced it as someone chosen, someone valued, someone who had, against every improbable odds, found a place where she truly belonged. The forest blurred past them as Cale ran through the darkness, carrying them both steadily toward the dawn, and toward whatever reckoning awaited at the end of their long and dangerous road. They reached the hidden camp just as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, finding the wounded survivor exactly where Cale's earlier scouting had placed him, sheltering in a shallow cave at the base of a rocky hillside. The man was younger than Elira expected, his face gaunt with fear and lingering injury, his eyes widening with a mixture of relief and terror when he recognized the king he had once helped ambush. I did not want to harm you, the man said quickly, before Cale could speak, scrambling to his feet despite an obvious injury to his leg. Voss threatened my family if I refused to participate. I have regretted it every single day since. Your regret means little without action to accompany it, Cale said, his voice carrying the cold authority Elira had glimpsed only rarely during their weeks together, the voice of a king, rather than the gentle companion she had come to know. Will you testify before the Northern Court? Will you tell them exactly what Voss ordered, exactly how he orchestrated an ambush against his own rightful king? The man hesitated only a moment before nodding, his shoulders sagging with what looked like genuine relief at finally being offered a path toward redemption. I will, he said. Voss's threats against my family lose their power the moment you reclaim your throne. I would rather face whatever consequences come from testifying than continue living beneath the weight of what I helped him do to you. With the survivor's agreement secured, they began the final leg of their journey toward the Northern Court, the survivor traveling with them now, his wounded legs slowing their pace, but his testimony too valuable to risk leaving behind. Elira felt the tension building with every mile they covered, the weight of what awaited them at court settling heavier across her shoulders, as familiar forest gave way to territory she had never before traveled. They arrived at the outskirts of the Northern Court as the sun began its descent toward evening, and it was there, at the edge of a great stone hall surrounded by gathered packs and armed guards, that their careful plans nearly unraveled entirely. A shout went up the moment Cale's wolf form was spotted crossing the open ground toward the hall. Guards scrambling into formation, hands flying to weapons, confusion and alarm rippling through the assembled crowd at the impossible sight of a king they had been told was dead striding boldly toward the very throne room where his rival now held court. "Hold your positions," Cale's voice rang out as he shifted, standing tall and commanding despite the travel-worn state of his clothing, his golden eyes sweeping across the stunned crowd with unmistakable authority. "I am Cale, rightful Alpha King of the Northern Pax, and I have returned to reclaim what was stolen from me through treachery and deceit." The doors of the great hall burst open, and Lord Voss himself emerged, flanked by armed guards, his face contorting through a rapid succession of shock, fury, and calculating fear, as he took in the impossible sight before him. "This is impossible," Voss snarled, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the confidence his words attempted to project. "You were killed in an ambush weeks ago. Whatever impostor stands before us dares to—" "Save your lies for the court," Cale interrupted, his voice cutting through Voss's protest with sharp finality. "I have brought a witness who will testify to exactly how that ambush was orchestrated, and by whose order it was carried out." The wounded survivor stepped forward at Alira's gentle encouragement, his voice shaking but growing steadier with each word as he addressed the assembled crowd, recounting in detail exactly how Lord Voss had gathered a group of loyal men, threatened their families into compliance, and orchestrated an ambush meant to leave the true king dead in the northern forests, while Voss himself claimed the throne through false mourning and manufactured grief. The crowd's murmur grew into an angry roar as the testimony unfolded, gathered pack leaders and court members turning increasingly hostile eyes toward Lord Voss, whose careful mask of confidence crumbled further with every word spoken against him. "Lies," Voss shouted, though his voice cracked with the desperation of a man who understood his carefully constructed claim to power collapsing around him. "This peasant speaks falsehoods to save his own worthless skin, nothing more." "Then explain," Cale said, his voice deadly calm, despite the fury simmering visibly beneath the surface. "Why this man's testimony matches precisely the wounds I still carry from that ambush, wounds that could only have been inflicted by someone with intimate knowledge of the attack. Explain why your men have spent weeks searching every settlement within days of that ambush site, hunting for a king you claim to have already mourned as dead." Voss's expression twisted with desperate rage, and in a final, reckless bid to salvage his failing claim, he lunged toward Cale with a speed that caught even the assembled guards off balance, a hidden blade flashing suddenly in his hand. Alira's scream tore from her throat before she could stop it, but Cale, trained through decades of leadership and combat, moved faster than the treacherous lord could complete his desperate attack. He caught Voss's wrist mid-strike, twisting with practiced efficiency, until the blade clattered uselessly to the stone floor, and in one swift, controlled movement, had the false lord pinned and subdued before the assembled crowd, guards finally rushing forward to complete what their king had already accomplished. "Take him," Cale commanded, his voice ringing with restored authority across the suddenly silent hall. "Lord Voss will face full judgment before this court for treachery, attempted regicide, and the attempted murder of his own rightful king." The guards moved quickly to secure Voss, dragging him away despite his continued protests, and as the immediate danger passed, Cale's gaze finally found Alira across the crowded courtyard, his expression softening from the cold authority of a king into something warmer, more relieved, more unmistakably grateful for her presence throughout the entire dangerous ordeal. He crossed the distance between them in quick strides, ignoring the murmurs and stares of the gathered court, and pulled her into his arms without hesitation, holding her close, as the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly drained from both their frames. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "Voss's treachery has been exposed before the entire court. My throne is secure once more." "You were incredible," Alira said, still shaking slightly from the fear of watching that blade flash toward him, from the sheer terror of nearly losing him after everything they had built together. "I've never seen anything like that. I have spent my life training for moments exactly like this one," Cale said, pulling back just enough to study her face, his golden eyes carrying an intensity that made her breath catch, despite the exhaustion weighing on both of them. "But I confess, none of that training prepared me for how frightened I would be at the thought of that blade coming anywhere near reaching you instead." Around them, the gathered pack leaders and court members began to settle, whispers of astonishment and relief rippling through the crowd, as the reality of their king's survival and Voss's treachery fully registered. Several of the older pack leaders approached cautiously, bowing with obvious relief and renewed loyalty, and Kale accepted their acknowledgement with the practiced grace of a ruler, even as his hand remained firmly clasped around Elira's own, refusing to release her, even as the formal business of reclaiming his throne began to unfold around them. "Who is this Omega who traveled with you?" one of the elder pack leaders asked, curiosity evident in his weathered features as he studied Elira with open interest. "She fought at your side against Voss's testimony gathering, and I understand from the guards, she stood firm even when his men searched her own home." Kale's expression shifted into something proud and unguarded as he turned to answer, his grip on Elira's hand tightening slightly, as though anchoring himself to her presence even as the weight of his restored kingdom settled back onto his shoulders. "This is Elira," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed courtyard. "The woman who found me wounded and dying in a hunter's trap, who nursed me back to health with nothing but her own kindness and courage, and who stood beside me through every danger that followed, without once wavering in her loyalty. Whatever debt this court owes for my survival, and the exposure of Voss's treachery, that debt begins and ends with her." A murmur of astonishment swept through the gathered crowd, and Elira felt heat rise to her cheeks under the sudden weight of so many curious eyes, though beneath the embarrassment, something warmer bloomed steadily in her chest, at the unmistakable pride and affection carried in every word Kale had just spoken before his entire court. "Then this court owes her a debt of profound gratitude," the elder pack leader said, bowing formally in Elira's direction, a gesture quickly echoed by several others gathered nearby. Elira, unaccustomed to such formal acknowledgement, felt her old clumsiness threaten to resurface entirely, her tongue suddenly heavy with uncertainty about how to properly respond to such unexpected honor. But Kale, sensing her discomfort, simply squeezed her hand gently and offered a small, reassuring smile, meant only for her. "There will be time enough for formalities," he said, addressing the crowd once more. "Tonight, I ask only for rest, and for the chance to properly celebrate the survival of both my throne and the woman who made that survival possible." As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs of astonished gossip already spreading through the gathered packs about the clumsy Omega who had saved their king's life, Kale turned back to Elira, his golden eyes carrying a warmth that made every danger they had faced together feel, finally, entirely worth the cost. "Come," he said softly, drawing her toward the great hall that now, once again, belonged fully to him. "Let me show you the home I hope you will choose to share with me, if you will have it." Elira followed him through the grand doors of the northern court, her hand still held securely in his, and felt, for the first time since her old pack's cruel rejection so many years before, that she had finally found not just safety, but a place where she truly, unmistakably belonged. In the days that followed Voss's fall, the northern court settled slowly back into its rightful order, though Elira found herself struggling to adjust to the sudden, dramatic shift in her circumstances. She had spent years learning to survive quietly at the edge of Thornwood Hollow, her ambitions never reaching beyond a full pantry and a roof that did not leak too badly during storms. Now she walked the polished stone halls of a northern court, surrounded by finely dressed pack members, who watched her with open curiosity, whispering about the clumsy Omega who had somehow captured their king's devoted attention. She tried, in those early days, to make herself useful, in whatever small ways she could, unable to shake the habits of a lifetime spent earning her place through constant labor. She found herself mending torn garments for court staff, who seemed baffled by her insistence on such humble work, tending small gardens tucked away in quiet corners of the castle grounds, anything to keep her hands busy, and her mind from spiraling into doubt about whether she truly belonged in a place so far removed from everything she had ever known. Kale found her one such afternoon, kneeling in the castle's herb garden with dirt staining her hands, and settled beside her without hesitation despite his fine formal clothing, an amused smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "The court staff tell me you have been avoiding the formal gatherings," he said gently, though there was no accusation in his tone, only quiet understanding. "I don't know how to belong there," Elira admitted, not looking up from the herbs she was tending. Those gatherings are full of Omegas who were raised knowing exactly how to move through rooms like that, exactly what to say and how to say it. I was raised knowing how to avoid tripping over my own feet while carrying water, and even that skill remains questionable most days. Cale reached over and gently took the trowel from her hands, setting it aside so he could hold her dirt-stained fingers in his own. Do you remember what I told you, the night we planned our journey to reclaim this throne? What I said about your worth? You said many things that night, Alira said softly, though she remembered every word with perfect clarity. I said that this court would learn to value what I value, Cale said, and what I value is not practiced grace or empty court manners. It is the courage that pulled me from a hunter's trap despite your fear. It is the kindness that tended my wounds without expectation of reward. It is the fierce loyalty that stood before Voss's own men and protected my secret with nothing but quick thinking and steady nerve. Those qualities, Alira, are worth infinitely more than knowing which fork to use during a formal dinner. Alira felt tears threatening again, as they so often did when Cale spoke with such unwavering conviction about her worth, a conviction that still felt foreign after years of being told the opposite by the people who should have loved her most. I'm frightened, she admitted quietly, the confession costing her something significant to voice aloud. I'm frightened that eventually you'll see me the way my old pack did, that the novelty of this will wear away, and you'll realize you deserve someone more suited to standing beside a king. Cale's expression grew serious, and he shifted to kneel directly in front of her, taking both her hands in his own, with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew he carried. Alira, I have led this court for years before I ever met you. I have been surrounded by Omegas trained from birth for exactly the role you fear you cannot fill. Omegas who understood every court custom, every formal expectation, every practiced grace that this life demands. And not one of them ever made me feel what I feel when I am with you. What do you feel? Alira asked softly. Safe, Cale said simply. Understood. Valued for exactly who I am beneath the crown, rather than for the power that crown represents. You saw a wounded wolf in a trap, Alira, not a king whose favor might elevate your position. You cared for me before you knew what I could offer you, and that is a rarer gift than any court grace could ever provide. He reached into his coat then, producing a small, simple ring, nothing like the elaborate jewels Alira might have expected from a king, but instead a modest band of silver, etched with a pattern that reminded her, upon closer look, of wolf's fur catching moonlight. I had this made from the very trap that first brought us together, Cale said, watching her expression carefully as understanding dawned across her features. A reminder that even the most painful circumstances can lead to the most unexpected gifts. I am not asking you to become someone you are not, Alira. I am asking you to remain exactly who you are, clumsy hands and honest heart and all, and to stand beside me as my queen, not despite those qualities, but because of them. Alira stared at the ring, then at Cale's earnest, hopeful expression, and felt every lingering doubt from her old pack's cruel rejection finally begin to loosen its grip on her heart. Yes, she said, the word coming out steadier and more certain than she expected, carrying none of the hesitation that had haunted her throughout her difficult adjustment to court life. Yes, Cale, I will stand beside you. Not as someone pretending to be a different person than I am, but exactly as myself. Cale's answering smile held none of the careful restraint she had grown accustomed to seeing in formal court settings. It was open, unguarded, and entirely genuine, and as he slid the ring onto her finger, Alira felt something settle deep within her chest, a certainty she had never expected to find after years of believing herself unworthy of any place beyond the crooked cottage at the edge of Thornwood Hollow. The formal announcement of their union spread quickly through the northern court, and though Alira remained nervous about the ceremonies and gatherings still ahead of her, she found the pack members' initial curiosity gradually shifting into genuine warmth as they came to know her. Not as a distant queen consort, but as someone who visited the kitchen staff to learn their names, who tended gardens alongside the groundskeepers, who never once let her new status keep her from the small, honest kindnesses that had defined her entire life. Old Nora Whitfield traveled from Thornwood Hollow for the formal ceremony, tears in her eyes as she embraced the young Omega she had known since childhood, marveling at the unlikely turn her difficult life had taken. Your mother would be so proud, Nora whispered, during the celebration that followed, and Alira, thinking of the mother she had lost so young, felt the words settle warmly into a heart that had spent too many years believing itself unworthy of pride from anyone. As the celebration continued into the evening, Elira found a quiet moment alone with Kale on a balcony overlooking the Northern Territories, the same lands he now ruled with restored authority and renewed purpose. She thought of the frightened, clumsy Omega who had knelt beside a wounded wolf in the mud of Thornwood Hollow, uncertain if helping a dangerous stranger might cost her everything, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed since that single, instinctive choice to offer kindness rather than fear. "Any regrets?" Kale asked, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders as they watched the stars begin to emerge over the territory, now safely restored to peace. "Only that it took so long for me to believe I deserved this," Elira said softly, leaning into his warmth. "But I think, perhaps, that everything happened exactly as it needed to. If my old pack had never cast me out, I would never have built the life at Thornwood Hollow that led me to find you in that trap. Every painful step brought me here, to exactly where I was always meant to be." Kale pressed a gentle kiss to her hair, and together they stood in comfortable silence, watching over the kingdom they would now build side by side, an unlikely queen, who had once believed herself too clumsy to matter, and the Alpha King who had refused, from the very first night beside her humble hearth, to ever leave her side again. Their story, unlikely as it had begun in the mud and blood of a hunter's trap, had become something far greater than either of them had dared to imagine, a testament to the truth that worth was never measured by grace or perfection, but by the quiet, stubborn courage to choose kindness, even when fear offered an easier path, and by the willingness of a wounded heart to trust, once again, in the possibility of belonging somewhere it was truly, deeply wanted.